first wrote Field in the fall of 1959 in Panacea, Florida. After finishing my thesis and delivering it to the history department, I drove south until I hit the Gulf and rented a cabin from a couple named Trice, a block from the water. In the fall of that year, Panacea was a ghost town, but one small store remained open where I could buy fresh fish straight from the Gulf, wrapped in newspaper. One night, as I cooked supper, I read from a reeking page a terse AP news story about an old man out in Iowa who'd stumbled onto a fence and been found the next morning, delirious, after circling a field all night. Those 50 words, at most, were the bare bones of Field. The story was lifted from that page. I wrote the concluding paragraph as it stands today, a few nights later in Panacea. Though most of Field was set down in that single evening, I've been writing and thinking about it ever since. What held me to Field for so long was the sense that there was something there, a kind of buried conduit, which contained a message, beneath or within the words, which deserved my attention. Sometime in the mid-60s, Mother began to notice strange lapses in Dad's behavior. Back then, no one had even heard of Alzheimer's. The best doctors around hadn't a clue as to what was happening to him. Because it was unrecognized, nameless, and unknown, it became metaphysical, an adversary with a capital A, from another dimension, invisible but lurking, with supernatural powers, with a presence far more menacing and sinister than if we'd known what it was and been able to name it. It was as if a shadow had come over him, which settled also over us, and especially over her. A shadow all the more powerful because we could not identify it. This was my history, his story. I'd started with Field as a prose poem. Then I'd tried to expand it into a novella. Finally, I cut it back to its roots, because I came to see it as a dance for those who suffer. It was also a premonition. Slowly it became an image in motion for the condition known to us later as Alzheimer's. It became a parable of Alzheimer's, an attempt, itself stumbling, groping, and blind, to choreograph this process, to give it a name. So it presaged also the very process and trial of its own composition, in its images of trance-like compulsion, of a dance-like struggle in the dark, and of defeat. Thus it became also, unwittingly, an allegory, in the root sense of, so to speak, as to imply something other, not only of the Father, but of the Son. And as this fact dawned on the Son through the years that followed, of all who labor and suffer, among the makers and begetters of those who are. But how and why so early? I've never been able to resolve this. How can I explain that last paragraph, which was written in that single evening, in the light of what happened to Dad later? Was it all an accident, a chance event? Life is full of these. Or was I guided by strange powers of recollection or foreknowledge, over which I had no control, but to which I submitted, unbeknownst to myself, one dark and rainy evening in Sadie Trice's shack in Panacea? It is something to ponder, and I have. The Father's gift. Demise, conveyance or transfer of an estate. Random House Dictionary. The words seem whole now. Underline seem. I'll never be certain. But if they've made it through, if Field has made it through, if I've come through with Field, it's only through his demise, only through his gift to me of mortal love. For the Father not only gives life, he gives us death also, translating his own. For had he not been mortal, he could not have called us here to replace him. For his death contains this call to the child to go on, translating this life. Le devenir des êtres est une offrande. Is this what makes the myth of a death which indebts us because it gives life, like a great bell echoing down the generations that tolls for us all? In the knell of the Father, we hear the morning bell awaken us into mortality. Becoming is the gift and sacrifice of those who are. Upanishads. Field. Of that unearthly state where pain dissolves away, dropped from the shuddering blinds, he blundered from the roadbed, staggering toward the smell of corn, before the husks whispering. In the sudden gust below the trestle, the withered, nervous man collided with the fence, and the shock bobbed his head in an arc over the wire, and he lost his spectacles, and his body rebounded, and he reached out slowly. His hand closed fast and opened, and he bowed over the field. His locomotive crept up the hillside, then dry stalks whispered thinly. He stood upright and bowed, held by the trembling wire he could not see. He let it go and stood in the colorless twilight, His knees gave way. He lowered his body and knelt. One iron furrow sanded his fingertips. He felt into the crevices. The light darkened. He withdrew his hands and sent them forward, searching, furtive. The ground felt unearthly, like metal. Snow filled the cracks. His sleeve caught on a barb. The wire lashed him. He tore himself free, hand over hand, clawing from wire to wire. He struggled to stand. He saw nothing. Gray air, odorless, crossed the field, filled his nostrils. A sharp point struck and stabbed. He flexed his fingers, closed them. The wire quivered. He clutched it with all his strength, and the fence post shook. He brought his hand to his mouth. He placed it on the wire. He heard the distant sound of friction. He ran his palm on the wire. The wind rose, stalks rasped. A parched tip tickled his eyelids, teasing them like a feather. A shadow flapped on his forehead. The light again darkened. He wondered if it were the night he saw approaching. The wind calmed and he was moving, guiding on the wire. The gray air rose depthless between his feet, before his face. He lifted one arm for balance and found a post. Then he lifted the other hand perilously. Stumbling, he lost balance. His fingers slid to a barb. The taut wire shook him and swayed low. He held himself close to the earth, soothing the wire, outstretched, motionless. He lunged for the post and fell, was lashed and trembled, hoisted himself and swayed in the calm. He extended his arms and crept on the tips of his toes. His fingers fled from the barbs and, quailing, caressed them. He could not cease moving, for the wire would not cease moving. He remembered the coldness of earth and the crevices of earth. The wire throbbed over the earth steadily. Rushing noise came from his body. Mucus foamed to his lips. He could not spit it from his teeth. His mouth would not open. His tongue stuck to his lips. He lifted his palm to his mouth and sucked his wrists. He tore his mouth open, cried out, retched, and spat. Tall, he lowered his head and lifted his other hand until his arms stretched wide above the field. After a long while, the fence did not end, and the man stepped past one post after another. When he stumbled, he no longer fell. The barbs became less jagged. The wire shook him, and they fought each other. The intervals between the posts lengthened, and he heard his train passing over hills. The sound became a humming noise within him, from which he always receded. In the air there was a rustling of dry husks, and a sudden cry snatched close from mountain walls, the wail of a child or an animal. The train climbed and passed away from him, and he heard himself hear nothing. Dust and mortal, cursed my father. He heard nothing, and distances drew close about the wire. Dark vistas, once before him, gathered behind him in the space of the field, far from him, within him. Why he came he did not remember, or what he had lost, or where he had begun, or to hope for its end, or to pause, or to fear. But the wire had become familiar. It supported him and led him, and its pain gave him forgetfulness. His other hand, wrenched free, stabbed for a post, and he sank through an emptiness. He was aware of nightfall and acknowledged his fear. He remembered without protest that he had moved for a long while and could not stop himself, even from falling. He rose again slowly. The wire had turned. He followed. He toiled a level ground. He bent his head on a hillside. Again and again he turned in the hollows of his memory. The cavities in his knees spread into his belly, his chest, his throat. He felt himself floating with the paralyzed, inert movement of a dream. When he tried to recover, he lost himself in his blindness, in the darkness, in the field. But the wire held him. The punctuated strands smoothed down his hands, and the wire became smooth. Dust and mortal, cursed my father. The wire held him upright and kept him moving, for he could not move alone. Dust and mortal, cursed my father. The wire became his direction, for alone he was lost. Dust and mortal, cursed my father. He and the wire were one thing, for together they consumed him. Wrapped in a flowing fever, he forgot his hunger and coldness, the wind and the sounds of the night, the darkness around him, and the fear of falling. He remembered the wire, and, possessing no other memory, he felt that he had known it forever. My father and I stand together, apart. the lake tilting on eroded sand, shimmering above the dead roots around his white head, between the trees. On the slope above the water, Dad waits beneath me, smiling, expectant. Gone for a moment, the stony look, the thoughtless stare, the pupils flat and cool as the distant water, clarified, focus entirely on the frisbee in my hand, as I coil and bow over it, nestle it close and let it go, wondering if he knows who I am. Oops, sorry, Dad. I've spun it wide. He settles on his heels and leaps. It catches a current of air, lifts, dips, and sails past him. Nicked by his fingertips, it disappears in the woods beneath him, down toward the shadowy glint in the rising, receding water. Sorry. We're playing with his prize frisbee, the gift with his portrait on it from years ago, familiar yet distant now, the generosity spendthrift of that forehead, its hoard of breadth, its largesse, secured by the sage economies, the thrifty savings and the decorum in that spare Scotch nose, snubbed neatly on its tiny bridge, the level eyes smiling with pleasure and confidence, with decision brimming also from the mouth, dark-haired, thoughtful, incisive, distinguished, a stranger from the prime of his life. A few steps down in the woods, he tracks it absently, looks about him, back at the house, then down toward the lake. And just as I think it's leaving his mind, he's losing it. He's lost. Almost trips over it, wedged between clumps of crabgrass and moss, looking up at him. He bends down stiffly and retrieves it, inspecting it warily at arm's length, his hands enfolded carefully, with all the recognition in his fingertips. He bows slightly over it and winds it back, inward, toward the center of his body and out, assaying his aim forward, cocking and uncocking his right wrist, clearing an imaginary path in the space before him. He looks up the slope, spots me, looks down and smiles. The face is smiling up at him. Thought he was lost, didn't they? Thought we'd lost him for good. He winds and unwinds the disc, pressing it into his ribcage. Can't seem to get rid of this fellow. He repeats the motion, perplexed, as if weighing the words, grins as they dawn on him, grimaces with a parody of effort, and lets him go. Now it happens again that we lose it, but the game, with its built-in continuity, its memory of finding, absorbs him. And now he returns the smile, speaks to it, to himself, to the man he was, and to me, holding to those links with recognition, kinship, continuity, language, with the words which convey and pass that smile to me. And I laugh as always, after him, and with him. And delighted with having pleased me, he keeps talking, speaks of it again when it is lost again, till gradually his responses become a part of the game, punctuating our losses. But sometimes he falls silent and stands still, looking about bemusedly, with the frisbee face up at his feet. I point to where it fell. "It's just over there, Dad," I holler. Or, It's down the hill a ways." "Yes, a little farther. Okay, right there, by the tree." And he may remember what we've been doing, and he may not. But I've begun to notice that if he keeps talking, he doesn't lose the thread so quickly, so entirely. Slowly then I come to realize that it isn't forgotten, that he is still searching, still feeling for some new way to grasp that thread, that he's speaking to remember, not just to keep in touch with me, but with what he is doing, to follow through toward apavarga, fulfillment, the completion of an action. To talk his way home, back toward his bases, toward that fellow on the frisbee. As if a spare strand of memory might be preserved in speech and woven into the process long enough to complete it. As if the fusing power, the fiber, the continuity of mind, folded into a few words bound together, might connect a few moments also, and let him complete them. Let him keep walking, reach down, pick up the stranger, and link up with him again, with his train of thought and life. The game did this for us, and in the lapses, when the frisbee stopped shuttling between us, the words began to do it too, some of it. There was a happiness here, and a rightness, a match for him in the disk floating down in the air. A small happiness, but intact. And I saw him reach out hungrily and take it in. And because he kept reaching, I kept reaching after him, till both of us were caught in the spell of the game, and in its deceptions, in its fantastic suspension of other processes, including Alzheimer's, in its obsessive image, its recurrent dream of recovery, an old play acted here for the 1000th time, till his loss seemed almost redeemable in that recovery, in his repeated finding of that face, his finding it again, his recognition, his remembering having found it before, a few moments ago. In the awareness through those few moments, a distance like centuries, that the face is his, or used to be, that the face is ours, because his loss was also my loss, and even my mistake. Since I'd thrown it wild, it was lost to us, and he found it for me also. This stranger he no longer is, whose gifts he no longer possesses, yet identifies with and is bound to, and playfully retrieves and raises again, and enjoys now sharing with me as he stoops and picks it up from its trap in the grass and sends it whirling in air back into the game again with its continuity, its memory. in the retrieval also of the words that come from there, spoken as that fellow would have spoken them years ago. Are we lost or found here? I wonder as I laugh and lunge and make my stab and stoop to retrieve it or him, myself, in finding himself lost, in finding the words for this, or the words finding him, my conjurer. As he went under, did he even rise on the remorseless surge of his affliction, using even dissolution, even the burning neurons, to strip back the words and bear them? Because he was able to tell, to find through the saying that he was lost, though he was lost indeed. I do not know. Yet slowly I begin to capture the drift of his purpose, to catch the brief words in their strangeness, their accuracy, their stripped, bare, swallow-boned reach into that vanishing landscape from which they floated lighter than air, effortless, self-born, gliding towards me like gossamer condors from his roofless ministry, over the cratered empire of his mind in its moon bareness, out of his absence, his impasse, destruction, remote, inaccessible to me, removed now even from his own grasp, except in this way. Even as I'm laughing, I'm struck by this, and reach back by habit for the tiny spiral notebook in my hip pocket, and jot down the last words so that I won't forget them. These are the words which follow and close this memoir. And they are indeed his last words to me, for less than a month later he is in Durham, high up in the barred room on the top floor, a tranquilized husk, a robot unable to speak, to remember who he is, stripped of every recognition, but most strikingly, because he was a mingler, always making contact, of company, of his awareness and the attentions of his fellows, the pitiful denizens of the ward who wander past him, drugged and lobotomized, whose harmless, oblivious stares swarm in their quietude about the sitcom, booming from the massive set in the center of the room. So changed, the doctor has to point him out to me, crouched on an empty bench, back in the farthest corner where no one else is, bowed over with his head in his hands, unbuttoned, stubble-bearded, stoned, staring at nothing, downward. I could not recognize my father, because he was spent, because he was beaten completely, because he had quit, his loftiest strongholds overrun, crushed, totally evacuated by the sinister invisible disease, the biceps and hypodermics which subdued him bodily when he resisted, so that his body also, the last garrisoned core of his resistance in its last retreat, was broken, the husk hollowed out. These are my last words from him, So I must bear witness to his last victory as well as defeat, because there also is most mysterious, his most spacious, and because they remain for me typical of his charm, with its unconsidered benignity, its countryman's blend of honed irony and wit turned poignantly against himself, packed with its native flavors from the pungent dust, shot through with the hot, high Georgia sun, borne barefoot between his toes from the longest Saturdays, spent sweating and whistling, off-key, behind a tractor, in time to his mom's eternal Sunday school, with a self-parodying grimace, grin, and revelatory gesture, which concludes the thought in its word part without cutting it off, opening it rather on the larger space, which includes the listener and much else, much that's delightful or grave or beyond understanding, but without charging us for its gravity or biting too deep. Civilized, then. I'm thankful. It is fitting also that the last words were recorded in a notebook, on the move, dictated, and for memory's sake. So merge with that life stream and flow in the work in my hand, but which is also his, which streams through my hand from him, from his hands, crossed over his heart, and my other sources. Streams rippling from the smile, the charm, the wit, the irony and the zest, the joy and affection of him, the memory which is his alone. Finally, it is most fitting that the last message was wordless, a fusion of smile, gesture, and silence, that he chose a smile, an inimitable mime, and a concluding silence to convey his last message, which was his first also, and his most lasting, the one he bore down with him as he withdrew from us, removed from us, but not before it had touched us irrevocably. So I salute him with it. So it abides. Last words, a document. Each group of phrases was spoken as Dad searched the grass, then stooped and picked up the frisbee with his photograph on it. And each ellipsis between the groups marks a pause when he completed his thought and smiled. I looked down there, and there was nobody there. He'll do. Quit looking for this fellow. We've got to find him. There's somebody around here, and I don't know what to do with him. Where was that man? He was so pretty. There's nobody here. I always know where I am. If you don't know it, Dad was climbing the path with the frisbee. At this point, he smiled and placed both hands over his heart.